the news director of WCBS reached out, flew me up surreptitiously for a test. I sat in the studio with Wayne Cabot, and we did an anchor test, and I thought it went pretty well. So she offered me a full-time job. And she said, and I said, listen, I got to tell you, I'm under contract. Chris was very keen to sign me to a contract right away, even though I wasn't making much money at all relative to others. And she said to me, oh, don't worry. I know Chris. We go way back. And you tell him that, you got this opportunity and I want you to come and he'll let you go. I said, okay. And so I went to Chris and I said, hey, Chris, I've got this great opportunity. And he literally, I watched him. I have this distinct memory. He pulls out his cell phone, calls WCBS, and speaks to the other manager. His name was Chris Quimby. And it's Chris on the phone. And he goes, what the hell do you think you're doing? Steven Portnoy signed to a contract. You can't have him. He hangs up the phone, and I was taught. Let me put it that way.
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
My guest today is one of America's most respected audio storytellers. With more than 2 decades of experience reporting from Washington, he has brought listeners to presidential inaugurals, congressional debates, State of the Union addresses, Supreme Court arguments, and some of the most consequential moments in recent history. He's anchored award-winning live coverage of everything from the death of Osama bin Laden to election nights, and even spent more than 8 hours on the air during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A past president of the White House Correspondents Association, his reporting has earned Edward R. Murrow Awards for breaking news, continuing coverage, and overall excellence. Please welcome ABC News Radio National Correspondent Steven Portnoy. Steven, welcome, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Chachi. It's great to be on with you.
For someone as young as you have already created such an impressive resume. Your bio, and you're a few years younger than me. I think you're mid-40s, right?
Yeah, thereabouts. I appreciate you calling me young.
To me, nice. You're very young, and it's very impressive what you've accomplished thus far. Tell me a little bit about growing up in South Brunswick, New Jersey.
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in South Brunswick, which is a town that's pretty close to equidistant between New York and Philadelphia. So I grew up in sort of straddling both of those markets. And from the earliest days I can remember, I was sort of a fan of broadcasting. Other kids my age may have been memorizing baseball statistics. I was memorizing call letters and sort of understanding how, the radio and television business is structured in the United States. And these were things that I was deeply, deeply interested in from, my earliest years. I mean, there's actually video of me. This is kind of crazy, but there's video of me as a 4-year-old boy talking to my dad's VHS camcorder, pretending to do the news for ABC, which is kind of a trip.
That is so cute. That's something that David Muir, at the end of the national news, they always do kind of a fun, heartwarming piece. They need to air that sometime. Right.
Well, it's funny because, I found it. My dad found it in a stack of VHS tapes that he had digitized or converted to DVD. Sure. And he sent it to me probably about 15 years ago, and I couldn't believe it because obviously I had no memory of doing that. And at the time I was working for ABC, and everybody just got a huge kick out of it. I couldn't use it as much on social media after I left ABC, but I did for about a decade. But as soon as I came back, it was one of the first things I posted on my Instagram was this video. So I was always destined to do this.
Who are some of the anchors and reporters and on-air talent that you would listen to and watch when you were growing up?
Well, I remember growing up. My dad was a big fan of talk radio, and my mom was a big fan of news radio. So I would listen in the car to people like Doug Limerick, Ann Compton, Vic Ratner, Peter Mayer, Mark Knoller, Harley Carnes, Deborah Rodriguez, some of the giants of network radio who I wound up working with, which is incredible to me. They were very early influences. Paul Harvey was another very early influence on me. Peter Jennings was a huge influence. And so to be able to consider them colleagues and friends is amazing.
That must be completely surreal. Did your parents, were they in media at all? Or just fans?
My father was in sales in wholesale plumbing supplies. My mother was a public school speech pathologist. And I actually give a lot of credit to both of my parents for sort of inspiring me to pursue this career, but really most of the credit goes to my dad because he was a Howard Stern fan and would listen to Howard Stern on WNBC radio and would make audio cassette recordings of the Howard Stern show that I now know to be air checks. We didn't know that term in our household at the time. But I remember as a young boy watching my dad sort of obsess over this radio show. And that presence of radio in our home, I guess maybe through osmosis, kind of sort of subconsciously planted in my mind the importance of this audio medium and how it could be so important to people. And it certainly was important to our household, even though we didn't appreciate it. It was only with distance that I look back and I say, wow, radio was a constant presence in our home and a really important force to an extent that I didn't appreciate until I started working at it.
And God bless your parents for all that TSL. I really
exactly. Yes. Well, it's funny because you think about the impact of the medium and its efficacy for advertisers, and I remember some of the ads for various places that would be advertised on the radio. 40 years later, I still remember some of those commercials.
I constantly hum jingles from the past, jingles of different products.
Oh, well,
cereal
Chachi, one of the other things I should tell you, you're talking to a jingle freak.
Are you really?
Oh,
I didn't know
man.
That.
Serving your backyard.
Listen by the pool and lock it in at the spot where summer never ends.
Backyard flashback. Backyard flashback. America. Steven Portnoy.
I have my own jock shout.
I love that. That sounds. Who did that for you?
Jonathan Wolfert did that for me.
From
this
Jam.
Summer. Yeah.
Jonathan, legend in the business.
For sure. I ordered that from John this past summer because I actually started my own little side project. It was an online radio station that I'm very proud of on Live 365.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I got to get hooked up with a Benztown imaging package.
Love to help you with that anytime. But John, talking about legends, he's a legend in the jingle business for sure.
For sure. Big fan.
No one does it better than him. That's awesome that you've got that. So growing up, your parents are consuming a lot of media from Peter Jennings to Howard Stern, and you're getting exposed to some of the best talent as a fan. Is this something that they embraced? Sounds like you knew early on you wanted to be on the air and get involved in news.
Yeah, I mean, my interests overlapped. And it was the general interest in broadcasting, the business of broadcasting, but specifically journalism. I was writing for my elementary school newspaper when I was in second grade. Somehow I was writing about the 1992 presidential election. And then
that's amazing.
Yeah, right. And then I guess at that point I would have been in fifth grade. But regardless, I remember following politics from a very early age and was involved in student government. And by the time I was in high school, I had the opportunity through our high school experiential learning program to do a summer internship, really just kind of sort of shadowing in the newsroom of WHWH Radio in Princeton, New Jersey, which at the time was owned by Nassau Broadcasting. And it was a small operation, the sister station WPST, much better known in the industry and in the region. But at AM 1350, which at the time was an adult standard station, mostly automated through the day, but some local hosts also had a local newsroom. And there were two full-time staffers who worked in that newsroom who I was able to follow around to the State House in Trenton, New Jersey, and also kind of sort of write some readers and other kind of copy. But importantly, this was an ABC Entertainment Network affiliate. And for me, it was my first hands-on exposure to some of the product that was put out by the ABC News Radio. Ann Compton, Vic Ratner, John Bascom, Bettina Gregory, cast of thousands of other correspondents who would file for the network. And my job as an intern for the radio station was, in part, to cart up from the hourly feed some of these pieces that would come down at 35 minutes and 30 seconds past the hour and then provide those carts to the anchor so she could play them on the air. And it was a really early exposure for me into the product and the service provided by a radio network to stations all across the country. And so in addition to the very brief period of time, but informative time I spent at WHWH, I was also lucky to have a similar experience at the New Jersey state-owned public television network, New Jersey Network, NJN, which had a robust news operation that was based in Trenton. And I spent almost 2 months at the end of my senior year of high school, basically like finishing out the year. It was this great program that they had at the time in my school where we could say we're done with school. We'd all been admitted to college and now it's time to get some experience in a workplace. And so for about 8 weeks, I remember sitting in that newsroom. Wasn't paid, totally sort of under the table, but official, and was able to shadow a reporter. And spent some time on the assignment desk, and it was amazing exposure to me as an 18-year-old. When I went to Syracuse University, which I had identified early on as a place that I really wanted to go because I'd heard that it had a really good broadcast program, but also because on a tour I was able to see some of the facilities, which at the time were mainly all analog, but still had meant that people could get their hands on and touch editing machines and make things. They had a robust student-operated radio station, and I thought this would be the place where I could really get knee-deep in this stuff that I love so much. I was a student there for about 2 weeks my freshman year when I realized that whatever was going on campus was cool, but that there was an opportunity for me to work off campus, which was even cooler.
I would imagine by this point, because you got in so early and here you getting this experience in high school, that you probably were more advanced than a lot of the students on campus.
That's right. And also perhaps just more deeply interested in the actual coverage of news. It's kind of wild, but at that time, we're talking 1999, this was a medium-sized market. I think it was 81 in the Arbitron rankings at the time. And we had in this market, David Muir was the local television anchor on the CBS station WTVH-TV, Channel 5. Jeff Glor was the primary anchor across town at the NBC station WSTM-TV, Channel 3. We had some top-tier talent, really, really great people at the ABC station that was then WIXT-TV. And on the radio in Syracuse, New York, Aaron Katursky was the primary afternoon anchor on WSYR radio, with some amazing talent beside him at the station that had just then been swapped from Cox to Clear Channel in 1999.
What an incubation, a town of incubation for incredible talent. Unbelievable.
Correct. So I had, the gumption to go to the internship fair that was put on at the Newhouse Studio A facility, where all the TV stations and the radio stations went to solicit interns. They were mainly looking for juniors and seniors, and you had all these kids dressed up in their coats and ties to hand in resumes of all the things they had done in the 3 or 4 years that they'd already been in Syracuse. And here I am showing up in a flannel shirt, literally 2 weeks on campus, and had 1 weekend worth of work at WAER, the NPR station owned by the university, which solicits students to volunteer. I had done a NatSot package of Jerry Falwell, who had visited a megachurch in a town nearby and had spoken about the then very vibrant controversy about the Teletubbies. He had said that they were unduly influencing young children. So I put a piece together. It ran. The station was very happy with it. I had a cassette of it in my pocket, and I showed up at the internship fair. And while there were all these long lines for the television stations, there was a woman standing behind a WSYR radio banner, and there was no one coming up to her table. So I walked up to this wonderful woman whose name was Tara Howard, and she took my tape and kind of sort of shrugged her shoulders and said, well, we'll see. And the next morning, after having played the tape, she called me and she said, how soon can you get here? And I said, well, I don't have a car, so how do I don't even know where the radio station is. This is not something at that time that was easy to Google. So she gave me directions. I called a cab, wound up going to the radio station, and she offered me an internship right there on the spot. She said, we need you here at 4:30 tomorrow morning. You willing to do it? I said, absolutely. And somehow I got special dispensation. I don't even remember how, but they allowed me to have a car on campus for this purpose. So I had my car back home in New Jersey. I went home and got it, drove it up so that I could go to the internship 2 days a week. I would intern in the morning on Wednesdays, I think Monday afternoons after class. So I would write for Tara, who was an extraordinary writer and broadcaster, who I later wound up working with at ABC, which is why I mention her. And in the afternoon, I would write for Aaron Katursky.
Unbelievable. And where are you getting this? I mean, because you're, I want to say thrown in. I mean, you actively went and just had talking about gumption. It's so impressive at such a young age to go and do that. Who's taught you along the way? Just various mentors or what you've heard on the air? How are you learning how to do the writing and the production?
The writing it's a lot of it is sort of self-taught. I mean, I remember when I was 12 years old from where I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey and thereabouts, there was a Barnes & Noble bookstore that had a radio, TV, film section all the way in the back. And most of it was books about the movie industry and, script writing and stuff like that. But they had a couple of books about television production and TV news. And I remember buying two important books. One was sort of a general overarching kind of sort of glance at the industry, which was interesting because I learned at that young age what a VOSOT was. A voiceover sound on tape.
Thank you. I did not know that.
Right. So that's an industry term. That's sort of the lingo of broadcasting and television in particular. It's when you're watching TV news and all of a sudden the anchor keeps talking, but all of a sudden you see video and the anchor talks over it. That's a voiceover. And then when the soundbite plays full screen, that's sound on tape, SOT. So VOSOT. They are also such things as readers and over the shoulder boxes and all these very technical things that I would later learn. 10 years later, as a college student, I was learning when I was a sixth grader, and so there was another book that I bought, which for me as a broadcast historian, I still hold dear, written by a man named Ed Bliss, who was Walter Cronkite's editor. He became a university professor, an American here in Washington, and wrote a tome about the history of broadcast journalism. And it goes deep. The book is called Now the News, and it's all about the history of our profession. And I devoured that book. It's basically a reference book, but I went through chapter by chapter and learned all about sort of the regulatory framework of broadcasting from the Radio Act of 1927 on, all the way through Ed Murrow and the creation of the World News Roundup on CBS, and all the way through television to the present day. So I had that book. But most importantly, I bought books about news writing when I was in middle school. And the books that were most important to me were written by Mervyn Block. And if you're interested, you can Google it. He, last I knew, was still around, was a news writer at least one or maybe two networks, and just had the sharpest glance at broadcast news writing. It was very critical of what would air at the local and network level, and would have these rules that you should follow for simple, how to write simple declarative sentences, subject, verb, object. He had these list of rules, stay away from appositive phrases and just speak the way people talk, complete sentences, but very direct and sharp. And I still, to this day, remember some of those rules. And one of the reasons why Tara Howard and I clicked so fast at WSYR was somehow he came up in the conversation. And I said, I have his books. And from then on, we got on famously. Tara wound up becoming a news editor at ABC Radio New York. She passed away from cancer some years ago. But she was a very important early influence on me.
Really are a broadcast savant. And I will tell you, I've done, I think this will be episode 72, 73, something like that. And you are amongst the most articulate people I've ever spoken to. It's really a pleasure to.
My mother gets the credit for that, the speech therapist.
So you're still going to Syracuse at this time. You didn't. You stayed in school, but instead of participating on the school station, you're now working or interning at YSR, and then you also become a TV. You're also now doing TV production as well on YSR TV. Yeah. So they've got both radio, an AM, and a TV station. Right.
So WSYR was at the time just taken over by
SYR. My apologies.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yep. Well, it's interesting because I remember. This is a strange aside. There was before in the earliest days. I was there really at the transition from analog to digital. We were still cutting in some respects on razor blade with reel-to-reel tapes. There was a DOS program, not Windows, but DOS, and they miscoded it. So the license was assigned to KYSR, which is, as you know, is not a station in Syracuse, New York.
It's a radio station here in Los Angeles.
Exactly, like Star 94. Right. So anyway, I always thought, I was like, that's not right. Someone should fix that. Anyway, so I was working at WSYR. After 2 months as an intern for Aaron Katursky and Tara Howard, they offered me a job. So then all of a sudden I start reporting, and they were paying me to do it. $8 an hour was the pay to report in the evenings for WSYR radio. And
so you're on the air.
Oh yes. At this point I was on the air. And writing and reporting and, putting packages together. And I would be up probably till, the shift was ostensibly 3 to 11 p.m., but I would be up until 2, 3 in the morning because I was a perfectionist, easily distracted, whatever it was. If you don't give me a deadline, I'll take as much time as I need. And I would be up all night writing, cranking stuff out that would air hours later, and I would stay up to listen to it on the air. So I spent most of my time when I was a student, not in class, not on University Hill in Syracuse, but actually out in the field, writing, reporting, and in the newsroom. At a certain point, my sophomore year, one of my professors at Newhouse, who was close with the TV management in town, had suggested that I interview for an open weekend producer job at WIXT-TV, which at the time was owned by a group called Accurately. And I went in for the internship and I said, listen, at this point, I'm only 19, way in over my head, but, it was recommended that I come in, and the news director was impressed and offered me the job. And it was way too early for me. I think, that was a really important experience for me because a producer, particularly on weekends, has outsized management responsibilities in a newsroom. They're responsible for assigning reporters, dealing with very experienced directors and production teams who, looked askance at a 19-year-old kid who only had worked on the radio for a year in town. I knew a lot. I knew how to write, which was most important. But I also needed to learn a lot about management. So my time at that television station didn't last very long. I was only there for about 3 months. Left that, went back to the radio station, upped my hours there, and all of a sudden now I'm anchoring on the weekends. And at that time, the station was doing 6 minutes an hour at the top of the hour, 24/7. At this point, if I remember correctly, 9/11 had happened. This is the beginning of my junior year. I remember working on 9/11 for WSYR, racing to Hancock Airport in Syracuse, because at that time, if you remember, on 9/11, they closed the airspace and planes were diverted to the nearest airport. So 4 planes had been told to land at Hancock Airport. So I raced there, going 100 miles an hour. I mean, the fastest I've ever driven on a highway was alongside New York State troopers as they were also heading to the airport. Nobody knew what was going on. But I remember that day clearly because I was asked to anchor the local cut-ins in our ABC network coverage. At that point, Clear Channel had decided, because we had a robust radio newsroom in Syracuse, that all the stations in upstate New York, everyone outside of New York City, would simulcast the newsroom of WSYR on Clear Channel, AM and FM. All the music stations dropped programming, and for days, we were the central focal point for all of upstate New York's Clear Channel stations. And I was on the air that night until 2:00 in the morning, inserting local information and news for all of upstate New York.
I remember that day very sadly, incredibly well. I worked for Clear Channel at the time here at Kabig and Coast, and I actually remember at both AC, Hot AC and AC radio station, but I remember that we were told by corporate to take a national feed. So you very well may have been on the air here as well. I'm not sure, but I absolutely remember all that happening, and it being obviously a horrific day. Yeah. That has got to be probably the biggest news event in our lifetime, and to be reporting something so incredibly scary and heavy and have that responsibility. You're what, 18 at that time? 19?
I would have been 20. And yeah, what I vividly remember, and this is why he was such a powerful influence on me, was the presence of Peter Jennings. Through that day, he too was on the air for probably, 14, 15 hours, maybe 16 hours, whatever it was. And then he handed it off to Elizabeth Vargas. I remember being on the air on radio, watching that handoff, but also him having the sturdiness, the presence of mind, the sort of dutiful responsibility to maintain a calm and sturdy presence on the air as no one in the country knew what was happening. That was very powerful for me to watch and try in the back of my mind to emulate.
And when you went to the airport to cover, and did you say it was Franklin Airport?
No, Hancock Airport.
Hancock. Yeah. So 4 of the planes get diverted there, and so you're reporting now from the tarmac or watching the planes come in, and obviously trying to gather as much information as you possibly can.
Right.
Did you have a producer with you or anyone helping?
No.
Or it's literally just you?
Yeah, radio reporters, particularly in local news, and even sometimes in network news, travel by themselves and do what they can to gather as much material as they can. And I remember, racing for a payphone because cell phones weren't working, and calling in to try to pop on the air. Again, the story wasn't there, but it was everywhere. I mean, everywhere in the country, people were panicked and afraid and not sure what was going on. And I remember, our very narrow focus at that point was the fact that these people had come, they had just either were heading to or just come from Boston, and the plane had landed in Syracuse, and they didn't know why, and nobody knew why. And so that, the initial shock was part of the story of the day. I remember by the evening, we were talking about blood banks and people volunteering and all the things that people, what can we do? Who's racing to the scene in New York City, and what more can people do if they want to help? And that was a big part of it that night.
Absolutely remarkable, and talking about being thrown into probably the most serious situation you could. And I'm assuming you did a phenomenal job, because after spending a couple years and going to Syracuse, and just to confirm, you graduate from Syracuse?
I did. Just to fill in the story, I wound up also producing at the NBC station, lasted about a year there, wound up producing some of the coverage of the first U.S. engagement in Afghanistan. Happened over a weekend. The NBC's theme was America Strikes Back. And so all of that, all the imaging and all of the promotional elements around that had been sort of prepared in advance. And so I remember it was on a Sunday night. I was the weekend producer, which again generally means that you don't have a lot of help. But because this was a big national news event, the news director came in and sort of peered over my shoulder, and the mainline anchors came in. So it was an hour. We did an hour at 11 o'clock, so full hour special locally. And we had a military analyst come in who had a map on set. And so that was for me a very important, very heavy lift for, again, a 20-year-old producer. I stayed at WSTM-TV and WSYR Radio. At that point, I was working 32 hours a week while I was still an undergrad. My transcripts weren't great. That is my college transcripts, but I learned a lot. And by the time I was a junior in college, one of my professors, who I really admired, himself a former network producer, had said, Stephen, you really ought to take an internship this summer. I said, respectfully, Professor, I'm working in 2 newsrooms, 32 hours a week. I don't know what the hell I need with another internship. And he said, no, you don't understand. ABC News is looking for a White House unit intern. They've come to us, and we're going to recommend you. And I said, well, in that case, where do I sign? Where do I apply? And I sent in my resume. There's a wonderful woman in our Washington bureau at ABC named Via Udenans, who was working as a coordinating producer on the White House beat. And she pulled my resume out, obviously was impressed, called me, we did a phone interview, and before you knew it, I was offered the internship for ABC News White House unit in the summer of 2002. And that was 23 years ago.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but people from all over the country apply for that. That's a very coveted.
Yes.
I actually seem to recall a friend of mine who I went to school with in San Diego applying for that, not getting it, but trying to get that internship.
I was very lucky. And also, looking back, I actually reflect on the fact that I was very privileged. This was at a time when the networks were not paying their interns. And I was fortunate to be able to, my parents were able to put me up in a GW housing over the summer in Washington, D.C. And I had some money saved. Remember, I was working a lot. I had a lot of personal savings, but my parents helped me pay the rent. And that was because I was lucky enough to be able to rely on that. I came down to D.C., left my jobs at WSYR and WSTM, gave them the proper notice and said, I'm off. Came down to D.C. and by the end of that summer, we were in serious talks about me taking an open slot on the Washington Bureau assignment desk. It didn't work out, and I'm glad it didn't, because I would have needed to figure out what I was going to do to graduate, because at that point I was only at the end of my junior year. And I remember, I'll never forget, the then Washington bureau chief at the time, her name was Robin Sproul, lovely, respected woman, calls me up to her office on the 7th floor of the bureau, and she says, Stephen, they're really talking to me about hiring you for this open slot we have. It was a nighttime assignment desk job. WGA scale would have been a lot of money for a 21-year-old. She said, Stephen, I have a daughter who's your age, and if she told me she was going to quit school to take a job on our desk at night, I'd kill her. I said, you go back to school, come back when you're graduating, we'll have something for you then. I said, but Robin, I'm reading in the trades that ABC and CNN are going to merge, and, I want to get my foot in the door. And she said, Stephen, 10 million people watch Peter Jennings do the news every night. We're not going anywhere. We'll still be here. And I said, okay. And I went back to school. Unfortunately, because I had given up my job at WSTM-TV, they gave it to somebody else, a really nice guy who wound up also working at ABC. He was very talented. So there was no longer a position on television. I didn't really want to go back to WSYR radio at that point. So I looked around for work and wound up working at an answering service in Syracuse. Same $8 an hour pay, but it was a way I could use my voice. And it was great. Did that for about 3 months, somehow figured out that there was a Syracuse University program based here in Washington that required an internship. It was a semester-long course in international relations. I had missed the deadline for applying by about 4 days. Emailed the professor and said, hey, shot in the dark, would you mind considering me? And this was my senior year. I had months left to go. And he said, why not? and he accepted me into the program. And I moved back to Washington. I emailed my contacts at ABC and I said, hey, this thing requires an internship in DC. If you'll have me, I'll come back. And within minutes, they responded right away. Absolutely. This was a lot more casual at the time than it would become for interns. But it was a function of the fact that, I was I was given pretty outsized responsibilities for an intern. I was essentially sort of serving as an let me call it production associate producer, whatever you want to call it. I was doing a lot more than you'd expect from an intern. So they had me back. And while I was there, I, at that point, had spent all the money that I'd saved working in local television and radio for the last 3 years. And, at one point I became 21 and I started going out at night. I started emailing every news director in Washington, D.C. that I could get my hands on their email address. And I said, hey, I'm here for this internship. It doesn't pay. I'd love to, come in on weekends and write whatever. I emailed every news director in town. I got one reply from the news director of WMAL here in Washington, who himself was a Syracuse grad. His name was John Matthews. And he said, I could never say no to a fellow Orangeman. Why don't you come in? So I came in. The station at the time, which was owned by ABC, had been managed by a legendary man in our business, Chris Berry, who about a year prior had left ABC News in New York to run WMAL Radio as general manager and vice president. They offered me a job, full-time, right out of college. I started freelancing there in February of 2003. The country was going to war in Iraq. I'm interning for the White House unit of World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Our piece is the lead every night of the week. I'm helping transcribe and log the comments of the president and Vice President Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and all these important things. And on weekends, I'm doing the local cut-ins on WMAL in the Washington area for people who are listening to the ABC News station in Washington. They offered me a full-time job just about after scale, which again was a whole lot more money than I was making in Syracuse.
Oh, I remember getting after scale in San Diego and going, I'm rich.
Yeah. I mean, that was the feeling. I mean, it was certainly when I was, I'll never forget the pride. I'm a big unionist. I'll never forget the pride that I felt getting the application paperwork for after. I felt like I was joining a fraternity.
Me too. I absolutely remember that. And I was so excited about it.
Yep. So started working at WMAL full-time, graduated on a Sunday, started full-time on a Tuesday. I don't know how I graduated, to be honest with you, Chachi. I arranged it with my professors. Now it's so simple. You call it, remote class, whatever. But at the time, I think they were still using the phrase correspondence classes. And I would somehow, without attending the lectures, write these papers that were assigned to somehow get my degree. And I was working at WMAL covering local news. And it was all very interesting. I mean, it would either be, the regional story of the day, whether it was related to the building of the baseball stadium that became Nats Park, whether it was related to, horrible crime incident, let's just say, or something related to pop culture. My newsroom at the time, my boss there, John Matthews, was a big fan of the intersection of pop culture and news. And so I remember one day I was sent to a metro station to stop commuters and ask who they thought should win American Idol when it was Bo versus Kerry. So, I mean, I did that for a while. And then I was like, I'm really more interested in the big, heavy, heady stuff, the big major news stories that the whole country's focused on. And I remember a couple of stories from that. Chris Berry is fantastic. And one of the things he taught me was the importance of adhering to a contract. At that time, I was being solicited by major market radio stations, bigger than Washington, D.C., to come and work in Los Angeles, New York. I had won some awards and, developed some presence in the industry. And there was an inquiry from WCBS in New York that was the station that I grew up listening to. And I was very interested in pursuing an opportunity there at that time. At that point in my life, I always thought I would live and work in New York. I've gotten over it since. But at that time, the news director of WCBS reached out, flew me up surreptitiously for a test. I sat in the studio with Wayne Cabot, and we did an anchor test, and I thought it went pretty well. So she offered me a full-time job. And I said, listen, I got to tell you, I'm under contract. Chris was very keen to sign me to a contract right away, even though I wasn't making much money at all relative to others. And she said to me, oh, don't worry. I know Chris. We go way back. And you tell him that, you got this opportunity and I want you to come and he'll let you go. I said, okay. And so I went to Chris and I said, hey, Chris, I've got this great opportunity. And he literally, I watched him. I have this distinct memory. He pulls out his cell phone, calls WCBS, and speaks to the other manager, whose name was Chris Quimby. And it's Chris on the phone. And he goes, what the hell do you think you're doing? Steven Portnoy signed to a contract. You can't have him. And he hangs up the phone, and I was taught. Let me put it that way. So I learned the contracts mean what they say, and it was very valuable. At that point, I was 24 years old. I learned. It was good to learn that lesson.
Absolutely remarkable. At 24, you were literally fly up to New York. Well, first of all, being on at MAL is an incredibly big deal in DC. And one would argue, I understand that New York's the bigger market, but DC is kind of the news epicenter of the world. So it's obviously a very prestigious place to be in the news business. And you get flown up to WCBS, the biggest news station in the country, right? In terms of audience at the time. Yeah. And I think wasn't Scott Herman and there at the time, and just all, what a,
well, and the station at that
group.
point had been located in that very brief period of time at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York on the 8th floor. So I'm literally in the same building as everyone at CBS News. And for me, it was just like, I can't believe I'm here. I don't know what this, someone's going to find out. I can't believe I'm here. In the end, it worked out fine, because even though the offer was more than twice what I was making in Washington, it was important for me to honor my obligation. And it was an important lesson for me to learn early in a way that was, we're all friends.
100%.
To learn and appreciate that we can all move past this moment and there are no hard feelings and it's okay. I do remember, though, I had negotiated an out in my first contract at WMAL for I could leave for any other ABC-owned entity. And that would mean either an O&O, like WABC, if they were interested, or the network. And so I remember I would have taken any job at ABC News. And I remember applying for some. There was an AP job, associate producer job at New World News Tonight in New York. And I remember applying for that job in an internal portal and getting rejected, because why wouldn't it happen? They have internal candidates and internal promotions and all this. And I remember receiving a very nice rejection letter from the executive producer of World News Tonight on official ABC letterhead and everything. I still have it. And I later saw him at an event here in Washington. I said, I got to tell you, it was very classy of you. He had no idea what I was talking about, but I didn't forget. What happened was, actually, it's kind of timely. 20 years ago, there was a terrible hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast of the United States. And when Katrina struck, one of the elements of that story at that time was FEMA, from a national standpoint, coordinates the deployment of what are called urban search and rescue teams that go from all across the country. These state task forces mobilize down to a disaster, and they have the very grim task of sifting through wreckage, looking for remains and making sure that they're recovered and properly taken care of. One of those urban search and rescue teams was actually from Fairfax County, one of the key jurisdictions that we covered at WMAL. They reached out and said, hey, we're going down. If you're interested, we're interested in coverage. If you're interested in sending a reporter. My news director went to Chris, and Chris called Steve Jones in New York, who was then the general manager and vice president of ABC News Radio. And they arranged for a buyout for me to go down to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi to cover Virginia Task Force 1 as it worked with the FEMA crews there. So I remember flying overnight to Birmingham, flying down in the evening to Birmingham, Alabama, renting an SUV and driving through the night all the way down to the Gulf Coast, which had been ravaged. I mean, this is right after the storm. There were trees sprawled across the highway in the middle of the night with no electricity. And I kept thinking to myself, what the hell am I getting into? Where am I going? I'm all by myself. I have at this point, there was no GPS. I think I had a map maybe printed out from MapQuest or something. And I know I have to keep, heading down this highway that should be closed. But they left it open because it was the only entry point for power crews and other rescue crews that were going down. And sort of getting around the trees on the highway, made my way all the way down to Gulfport. And by the morning, I was on WMAL doing two ways. When the cell phone service would allow, I had at that point probably 3 devices with me, including Comrex Matrix, which some of our broadcast listeners will appreciate, which at the time was a device that would, in the earliest days of 3G,
that was cutting edge technology, right, man,
would allow for over the air transmission of a high quality broadcast remote. So I had my Comrex Matrix, and it was at one point the only device that would work because I think it was on a nascent T-Mobile network that was different from Verizon and AT&T, which were overloaded. So I was able to get on the air and make calls, file for the network, and was there for a whole week. At first, completely by myself. In fact, John, my news director, said that he had booked me a hotel room at a bed and breakfast in Gulfport. So I show up at the place that John had pointed me to, and there's this old man behind the counter. He's like the only one there. He goes, "Reservation? We don't have power. I don't have a reservation for you." But he looks left, he looks right. He goes, "Here's a bucket and a room key. If you want, use the bucket to go to the pool out back, and that'll help you flush the toilet." So that was not great. But also, one of those things where, you realize, especially when you're covering a disaster, you just have to dive deep and do your best to kind of sort of take care of yourself. While
you go into a situation like that, do you have any idea how long you're going to be there? How do you pack for that? How in accommodations? Did the power end up coming on? What did you end up doing?
The power, as far as I remember, had only been restored at the very end, and that was at the end of a week. We had a sense. I remember going to in fact, maybe one of the last pieces I did from there was at a Waffle House. Because one of the things, and this was something that came out of Katrina and other storms since, is there's this Waffle House index, which kind of sort of measures a recovery from a storm when Waffle House restaurants start to reopen, because they're all over the South.
No way.
And so you can Google it, Waffle House Index.
I had no idea.
But it was one of those things, because my news director, John Matthews, had so much of his own experience covering hurricanes in the Southeast over his career, he gave me some good advice. As soon as you get the car from the airport, go to a Walmart, go to a Target, whatever, and buy, every box of power bars you can find. Get a whole case of bottled water, and just have it in the back of the truck.
That's
really
that was
smart.
What you do. You're preparing for a disaster. You're going into the disaster as most people are leaving. But
correct.
That is really fascinating work, man, and it takes a lot of guts. I have so much respect for going into an event like that, or the danger that so many reporters put themselves in to be able to ultimately get us the news, which I think is incredibly important. Were you scared, or it was just adrenaline running, or a combination of both?
Or maybe some naivete or stupidity on the part of a 25-year-old who thought he was invisible. I think I wasn't even 25 then. I think that, if I had to do it again, I'd probably do it again, but I think I'd be even smarter about it. And these days, technology has advanced to a point where we can be constantly in touch. Text messaging was barely a possibility back then. And so, certainly remote email was not something we were doing. It was difficult, but I think, we lived within our limitations. I also was very lucky at that point to, at a certain point, a few days in, embed with the broader ABC News team. And so I had support. I remembered I spent an entire day before I had hooked up with the ABC team in a gas line, going from station to station. One concern I had was, do I have enough cash on hand? Because no ATM is working. And I think maybe I had $100 in my wallet, whatever it was.
Jeez.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that, but yeah, everything would have been cash-based.
Right. So, I think, luckily, technology has advanced to the point where, satellite technology allows for, internet connectivity no matter where you are with Starlink. And, it's hard to envision yourself being truly out of touch like we were back then. But it was definitely a very good learning experience. I mentioned that I was, coming up at the very point where we were transitioning as a profession from analog to digital. And I was sort of on the vanguard of that. I remember writing a white paper for WMAL at the time about how to first use Wi-Fi transmission in the field to file high-quality reports, because in that era, it was understood and expected. You would just use your cell phone.
Right.
And before that, you'd call in from a payphone, and you'd have alligator clips and all the things that you would hear about. Then I never used alligator clips, but when I was in Syracuse, and by that point in Washington, everything had already transitioned to digital, but they still had carts on the wall. WMAL was a full-service radio station up until the late 80s, early 90s that would play music, MOR, middle of the road, adult Barbara Mandrell and Frank Sinatra songs. And they had these carts in the main master control studio that had sat dormant for probably about 15 years. And I was very sad the day they took them out. But at that point, they'd already corroded and you could barely play them anymore.
When I first moved to LA, Rick Dees was still using carts. And I remember you used to have to degauss the carts. So if you wanted to reuse the cart, you had to degauss it. And,
yes. Bulk eraser.
Yeah, exactly. In 2006, ABC News is obviously takes notice in what you're doing, and you do this exceptional coverage from Katrina, and you start to be their legal affairs correspondent and a regular host of Ahead of the Curve, which was a technology-based show. So how did all that evolve?
Steve Jones had offered me opportunities to work on weekends and in the evenings while I was still at WMAL. I would leave. I worked morning drive at MAL, so I would work from 4:30 a.m. to 12:30 in the afternoon and spend 20 minutes in traffic getting downtown to work an evening shift at Network. And so I was for about 6 months working double duty. So making a ton of money, but also, being very, very thinly stretched on both ends. So I would get off
a lot of hours.
Local news in the morning and then go to Network. And, that shift, they wanted me to stay around until 9 o'clock at night. I think John and Chris said, no, we're going to let you have them for about 6 hours, not 8. I did that for about 6 months until there was a legendary newsman named Bill Greenwood who had worked at ABC for a few decades. He had retired, and there was all of a sudden an opening on the radio headcount at Network. And because I had that out in my contract and because we're all friends, Chris said, go for it. And I was able to take that job in July of 2006 and became a general assignment correspondent alongside the legendary Ann Compton, Vic Ratner. We had Pam Coulter in our newsroom at that time. We had Doug Limerick was doing morning radio newscasts out of our Washington bureau. There was a full, robust staff of writers and editors and senior editors, and it was just an amazing experience for me. I had made it. I mean, I'd made it in network news. I'd made it in network radio news, and that was in 2006. I remember the mergers that happened. Citadel came in and acquired the ABC station group and network in 2007, and while ABC News maintained production and distribution, production of ABC News Radio. We had some cuts through that period. By the end of 2014, I had done a number of things. I had covered Capitol Hill for a bit when Vic was not available. I'd covered the White House when Ann was not available. And by the end of 2014, they both retired. And so I was covering basically everything in Washington in 2014.
Fill me in, covering Washington, whether it's the Capitol or the White House. How does that work? You get special credentials that let you onto the grounds of the White House and into the Capitol. Explain just all of that to me, because I was just in D.C. a few months ago, and I'm fascinated by it all.
Yeah, I mean, the structure of the credentialing on Capitol Hill is very interesting because it actually dates back to the late 1800s. The idea was that you had newspaper reporters from all over the country that were interested in covering Congress, and how do you manage the flow of reporters and information? And how is it governed? And a really remarkable thing that in the 1870s, there was this idea that the correspondents who were assigned to cover the Capitol would themselves create a committee of what they call the Standing Committee of Correspondence that would vet applications and decide, okay, this is a bona fide reporter. They come from a reputable outlet. And so emerging from that, you have various what are called press galleries up on Capitol Hill. There's the daily press gallery for reporters, the periodical press gallery for what are historically magazine reporters, although today it covers a lot of websites. You have the radio and television correspondence gallery, which was formed in the 1930s by some of our predecessors. And there's a photographer's gallery. You apply through the galleries for a credential. And it's fellow reporters who assess your application, look at the ownership structure of your organization, make sure it maintains a degree of independence from its ownership, and then they will grant you a credential. With that credential, which is all important to every reporter in the greater Washington area, you have access to covering Congress. It also provides you with a degree of access to the Supreme Court and the federal courts here in Washington, D.C. The White House operates somewhat differently. The White House takes applications. In some respects, a hard pass can be contingent on your holding of a Hill pass, and the rules have changed in some respects over the time I've been here. At a certain point, once you establish frequency as a White House correspondent, the White House will grant you a permanent credential, what we call a hard pass, where you can come and go without having to prearrange security screening through Secret Service. They do a full background check, and you receive a hard pass. And I've been a hard pass holder for about probably 10 or 11 years.
How long you're up on Capitol Hill, and do you get advance notice before a senator or a congressperson is going to speak, or are you guys sitting in these galleries and just kind of waiting, or how does that work?
Well, the watch never ends. In fact, as I'm speaking to you, Chachi, I'm looking up at my monitor and I see I'm looking at a picture of the House and Senate floor feeds, and the Senate appears to be in a quorum call, which means that it's sort of everyone's waiting for whatever's going to happen next to happen. Sometimes the House goes in recess, subject to the call of the chair, and we all just wait for things to happen. But the communication staff of the members and the leadership are often in direct touch with us, so we know if there's something that's about to happen. They might give us a heads up. Hey, Senator Schumer's about to go on the floor and say something. Or something along those lines. There's scheduled news conferences, and we obviously know to cover those things. But oftentimes, things just happen, and it's incumbent on us to just sort of leap on it when it does. So the watch never ends.
That's fascinating. And do they give you like a place to work where you can, bang out your story or whatever it is that you need to do?
Part of the arrangement on Capitol Hill in particular is for gallery members to have permanent fixed workspaces up on Capitol Hill. And so each of those galleries is on the third floor of the Capitol, on the House side and the Senate side, above the chamber. And it's, important for us to maintain that presence. We have fixed hardline wire arrangements that go through those booths, and it allows for us to broadcast live from various locations. And hats off to the engineers who, starting in the 1920s and 30s, worked with the House and Senate, really the House, to arrange for live broadcasts. I'm a broadcast historian, and one of the things I'd like to do is to go back and listen to some of the coverage from the 30s of President Roosevelt's addresses to Congress. The most famous one we could think of is the one after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Right.
That was, of course, broadcast live from the House chamber. But before that, in the late 1930s, there were similar broadcasts. And John Charles Daly was the CBS correspondent who was responsible. He was a founding member of the Radio and Television Correspondents Gallery that I spoke of. He was responsible for bringing the president on the air on CBS. And so when I worked at CBS and covered the Hill, I did a deep historical dive into this stuff because I really think it's important for us to at least know who our predecessors were and pay our respects. But it's a through line, it's a continuum. That coverage of Capitol Hill by these radio and television networks hasn't ended since it began almost 100 years ago.
We're going to get into a little tease here into your preservation. The Library of American Broadcasting Foundation is going to be awarding, we're so excited to do this, Stephen, with a Broadcast Preservation Award. So I'm going to have some more details about that in a few minutes, but this is why, man, the understanding of history that you have and it is really just truly remarkable. Thank you for that education. I had no idea how that worked. It's really fascinating to me. What made you decide to leave ABC for a little bit to go to CBS, and tell me about that part of your career?
Yeah, there were some dynamic changes in the business, and you had an episode where you spoke to Steve Jones about this period where things were happening rapidly. I had been approached by Harvey Nagler, legendary manager at CBS, about an opportunity to join his team, and sought that opportunity. And for me, it really was a tremendous professional growth experience because I was able to focus on coverage of Congress and work with the CBS News team and really hone in on that. Did that for 2 years and then was assigned to cover Donald Trump's White House and did that for the entire Trump term. We just paid our respects to Mark Knoller, who was the legendary CBS News radio White House correspondent for many, many years, and established for himself a tremendous, unique role and responsibility as sort of not just the keeper of statistics. So much has been made of that, but also he was just an outsized presence on the beat, as a mentor to younger reporters, as someone who asked sometimes the obvious question, what did the president do today? He had his own interest in keeping his own records of those things, but I think the essence of that was the idea that, we're here on behalf of the American people to ask questions as basic as that. The President of the United States has all this awesome power and all these, access to information and a huge staff. What did he do today? We're entitled to that information. Taxpayers are, voters are. So Mark was given, CBS Radio was given a seat in the second row of the briefing room by the White House Correspondents Association. I was able to take that seat. I was elected president of that organization. It taught me a great deal about leadership and about some of the inner workings of the press corps and its interaction with the president. We were able to put on the very first dinner, the White House Correspondents' Dinner after COVID. It was a great night. We had President Biden there. We had Gayle King took part. We had Trevor Noah was the headliner.
I remember that event. That was those events are world famous events. I mean, and let's back, because I want to dive into that, but I want to go back really quick to being the White House correspondent and what that means. So similar, obviously, to Capitol Hill, you get credentialed. Is there a workspace for you guys there? How does all that unfold when the president's going to speak, or the communications press secretary?
In the West Wing of the White House, there's a rather small and very cramped area that is devoted to press. The tradition of reporters covering the White House on campus really stems out of the presidency of William McKinley, and after that, Theodore Roosevelt in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And Theodore Roosevelt famously would hold press conferences in the barber's chair and have reporters all around him. And you think, Trump holds forth, and he does. But imagine, literally like, a lathered up Teddy Roosevelt, barking things out while they're trying to give him a shave. And so obviously that was not recorded, and it was only for newspapers and wire services, but it all emerged. In the early 1970s, the decision was made to take FDR's swimming pool, which John Kennedy used, and board it up, cover it up, put a floor on it, and turn that into the press lobby, as it was called. Nixon wanted all the reporters who had some other space in the West Wing kind of sort of shoved into this more narrow press lobby space. And if you look back on news film from the Watergate era or the Carter era, you'll see press secretaries or even the president himself standing at a podium and all the reporters standing up, sort of crowding this space. That's the briefing room without any chairs. There were couches and ashtrays and, sort of a loungy type experience, but it was not the theater that you see when you watch a briefing today. In the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan's administration put in the seats. There were, I think at that point, there were 42 seats. There are now 49, 7 rows of 7 seats. And the decision was made early on that it would be too cumbersome and too problematic for the White House to assign those seats because they didn't want to have to deal with recriminations and people squawking it was unfair and all this, that the White House Correspondents Association, which was formed in 1914 to sort of serve as a sort of self-governing enterprise of the press corps, the WHCA had the responsibility of assigning those seats to its members. And that carries forward to today. The workspace that's behind the briefing room, cramped, is assigned by the WHCA to the networks, the newspapers, the wire services, emerging digital outlets. And there are hundreds of competing outlets that work out of the White House every single day. It's incredible, from all over the world. It is a busy, crowded workspace. And it's important, I feel, not just as a former president of the WHCA, but also as a former White House correspondent, that in a space like that where you have so many aggressive competitors working, alongside one another, that there is some sort of a self-governing structure, a student council, if you will, just somebody, a safety patrol, whatever, who can say like, hey guys, clean out the fridge. Hey guys, when we stand up in line before we go outside, let's make sure that some degree of order here. And the fact that we have elections and it's an open process, I think is important for people to understand. Suffice it to say, it is a very interesting beat. And I was on it for 7 years, covering the entire first Trump term and the first half of Joe Biden's presidency. At a certain point, I made the decision, having served as president of the WHCA, having probably sat as a single reporter representing my outlet in more briefings than any other reporter, because a lot of other outlets had more staff than we did, on the radio side particularly. I made the decision to come off the beat. I had traveled all over the world on Air Force One with the president, with 2 presidents. And, at a certain point when you stay in the Warsaw, Poland, Westin Hotel for the 3rd time, you realize that there's a bit of repetition to this. And I thought, I'm going to let someone else do this. I'm going to see other opportunities. And I had an occasion to return to ABC, and I'm so glad I did. I did that in the summer of 2023. And I've been back here at ABC, my home, ever since.
One more quick question, if you don't mind, to indulge me on the White House, because I find all of this so ridiculously cool. Tell me about the first time you went on Air Force One.
Well, the first time I ever went on Air Force One was in 2008. And this was while Ann Compton, the legend, and also a former president of the WHCA, was on vacation. George W. Bush was president, and he had held what we now call the Three Amigos Summit, the North American Leaders Summit. The U.S. was the host that year. That's U.S., Canada, and Mexico. U.S. was the host that year, and it was in New Orleans. It was meant to be an emblem of that city's recovery 3 years after Katrina. Anne had a previously scheduled vacation, couldn't go, and it was important that we be there. Certainly competitively, it was important that we be there. Mark Knoller was going to be there, so ABC, we needed to be there. So I was asked to go to New Orleans, traveled what we call unilaterally, which means that I flew commercial on my own.
Okay.
Joined up with the press corps, entered the bubble, and had the responsibility as the radio pooler on the flight back. There are 13 seats in the press cabin of Air Force One. Each one of them, historically, has been assigned by the WHCA, and the radio pool is a subset of it, and the radio networks collectively are able to assign that responsibility to a particular reporter. I got the assignment, and we flew from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, where Bush had a fundraising gig or some sort of event. They took the pool to a garage on some very large, detached garage at some very large palatial plantation estate type scene. And I couldn't believe just how nice it all was. It was a mansion, and we're sitting there, and they had boxed lunches for us, and there was a sports car in the garage, and I'm like, oh my God. And then we flew back from Baton Rouge to Washington, and I'll never forget going into the lavatory of the press cabin, and it's at the very end of the plane, just, in the tail, practically, and going into the lav and seeing how spotless it all was. Like literally the chrome was shining. I could see my reflection, and I'm imagining that some airman from the Air Force has a responsibility every day of going in there with a toothbrush and scrubbing everything. I mean, it was just out of this world, exquisite. I mean, really nice. And the food's pretty good too. I mean, I remember somewhere I have a picture of it. It was like a bowl of spaghetti with meat sauce and, side of garlic bread, and best food I'd ever had on a plane in the United States.
At that moment in time, other than joining, I mean, what was, if you have to define just kind of the coolest moment in your life so far? We know that obviously joining AFTRA, going up to WCBS to 24 to do an air check, becoming, and I do want to dig a little bit more into the WHCA and how you got elected to that, was the most surreal, getting on Air Force One?
I mean, at this point, I hate to say it, I don't want to sound cynical, but I've done it so many times. So what a flex that is. I got to think, I don't know if I can identify the single coolest thing I've ever done. Maybe getting a jock shout.
From John Wolford?
Exactly. I don't know, but otherwise, I'm not really sure if I could. I mean, look, I've witnessed so much history, and I've seen so much. I've been so fortunate to have my hands on all of it. I think, look, I can think of some flashpoints that really do stand out. You mentioned off the top of the show, I anchored our ABC News radio coverage of the death of Osama bin Laden. That's a story that I could tell. This is the spring of 2011. We were focused that weekend on what was going to be one of the final space shuttle launches. I had been sent down to fill in for Vic Ratner to cover a space shuttle launch. Vic had covered everything from Apollo all the way through to the space shuttle. I have actually obtained a recording of him covering Apollo 11, which is out of this world. And
no pun intended.
Right. And so Vic was unable to travel to take this assignment, so I was assigned the responsibility. I went down to Florida. The launch had been scrubbed. I don't remember why, but it was kind of a letdown. I was like, oh man, I can't get to do the whole exciting depiction of the launch, but it'll be fine. I'm flying by. I missed the correspondents' dinner that weekend. And as you know, it's sort of famous. Seth Meyers was the headliner that night, and Donald Trump was in the audience. And there were jokes about Trump that he apparently didn't like, and that's part of his legend.
I remember
and
that.
The lore of the dinner. But Obama killed that night, and so the very next night, I'm flying back on a flight from Orlando, way in the back of the plane, seat 34D, whatever it was.
Not as glamorous as traveling on Air Force One.
No. And worse, it was like the last flight out on a Sunday evening. So it's, imagine, from Orlando, it's a plane full of kids coming back from Disney World. Well, it's great. But anyway, we land. At that point, we had, of course, mobile email, and I had my BlackBerry, and we land at about 9:45. I turn it on, and at the very top come flooding in all these emails. At the time, Jake Tapper was our ABC News White House correspondent. He's flagging for the whole news division that the pool that covers the president had been scrambled. A lid had been called. That's the signal to the press that there'll be no more news made that day. A lid had been long called on a Sunday, but the lid had been lifted. The president has summoned the pool. He wants to address the nation in 45 minutes. Now, I'm on this plane. We just hit the runway at Reagan National Airport. I'm in the very last row. I'm fidgeting, like literally physically fidgeting, because at that point I'm thinking, I now have an obligation, a professional obligation like a firefighter to race to whatever this is. We have no idea what it is. All we know is the president is addressing the nation at 10:30 Eastern time, and I want to be a part of it. And I don't know what our plans are. I think Ann had been on vacation that weekend too. Aaron Katursky, at that point, an ABC News correspondent alongside me, had been in Rome on vacation. And there was nobody in position to do what we needed to do to provide coverage for our affiliates at that point, other than me. I had this in the back of my head. So I emailed the on-duty desk editor and I said, I'm at the airport. I'll get to the bureau as soon as I can. It's only a 15-minute cab ride away. I'll be fine. I'm fidgeting because this plane is very slowly taxiing to the gate. And there are all these kids who have to get off before me. Oh, and by the way, because I'd covered the space shuttle launch, I had all this gear in the baggage hold that I was going to wait for at baggage claim. At this point, it's got to be 10 after 10. The president is scheduled to address the country in 20 minutes. I finally get my bags and I go outside and I'm thinking to myself, the only shot I have at making it by 10:30 to the bureau is if I get the very first cab. Well, it's a Sunday night. I'm thinking there may not be anyone in line for a cab. I go outside. This is before Uber, or before Uber was widely used. I go outside and there have got to be 75 people in line for a cab.
You're at Reagan, I hope.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So, but I go to the front of the line. I say, in a city full of important people, I'm pretty important right now.
Yeah.
So I go to the front of the line and I feel like I recognize this woman. I swear to God, I recognize this woman. African-American woman, I recognize her. I say, hey, Gwen? She turns. It's Gwen Ifill, who was then the anchor of the PBS NewsHour.
Oh, no way.
I said, Gwen, I'm Steven Portnoy from ABC Radio, and I've got to get the next cab. She, of course, had been on Twitter at the time and was aware of the developments, and she said, oh, yes, you do. Go right ahead. Let me cut the entire cab line. And I made it to the bureau maybe by 10:26, made it upstairs to our studio, which had been dark, turned on all the lights, sat in front of the mic. They basically just threw me on the air, and I carried our coverage on the radio for 5 hours that night. We won an Edward R. Murrow Award for breaking news coverage that night. And I remember hearing from friends who were in New York, who were in a cab heading down to Ground Zero to celebrate the death of Osama bin Laden. And they heard me in the cab on 1010 Wins, which was carrying our coverage. So for me, it's hard to beat a moment. As a radio news guy, it's hard to beat a moment like that. But in particular, the fact that all the stars had aligned for me to be in that place in that moment. And it would not have been possible without, again, me taking the bold risk, going to the front of the line, having the luck of seeing a fellow correspondent, fellow news person, the great Gwen Ifill, who was gracious enough to let me cut the line. And, it was a crazy night.
That is what an incredibly cool story. And there was just a documentary you may have seen, I think it's on Netflix, about that operation happening. Yeah. It's phenomenal if you haven't seen it. Really, really well done. Do you have the air check from you breaking the news?
Yeah.
This is live coverage from ABC News. Here is ABC News correspondent Steven Portnoy.
Osama bin Laden is dead. ABC News has learned that the founder of Al-Qaeda, the mastermind and the man responsible for the 9/11 attacks...
Let's talk about your awards, because it is really impressive, especially at your age. And we're going to talk about this other one that we've already teased here that you're going to get in November. We're really excited about. You've won a Hearst Journalism Award, a Bayless Horizon Award, a Peter Jennings Fellow at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and several other local Edward R. Murrow Awards for your coverage of the Virginia Tech Massacre, the Boston Marathon bombing, and obviously the death of Osama bin Laden, which you just spoke about. I mean, that's just so impressive, Stephen. In the Library of Broadcasting, a Library of American Broadcasting Foundation, which we call the LABF, is going to honor you with an Excellent Broadcast Preservation Award at the Giants of Broadcasting and Electronics Arts at the 22nd Annual Luncheon that's going to be at Gotham Hall in New York City on Friday, 11/14. Congratulations, man, on that award. It is so well-deserved. Listening to you just talk about your knowledge of broadcast and certainly U.S. history and global history has just been a treat for me, and really excited. By the way, and I also want to note that some other honorees that are going to be getting Giants Broadcasting Awards, Rick Dees, Leslie Visser, who of course I'm sure you know, and your colleague David Muir. So it's going to be a great day and a great luncheon. If anyone's interested in tickets, all the proceeds from the ticket sales go to the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation, which is housed at the University of Maryland. And basically, the LABF is tasked with preserving broadcast history. So many Westinghouse, CBS, a lot of companies have actually donated all of their archives to the LABF, and much of that is getting digitized and is available to students and people that are making documentaries, and we're really here to preserve history, and really excited to be giving you this award. Congratulations on that, Stephen. And if you're interested in tickets, you can reach out to Debbie at 723-245-7799. That's 723-245-7799, or reach out to me. We'd love to have you. It's a beautiful venue.
Thank you, Chachi. I really appreciate it. I have said I almost feel like I don't deserve this award because it really is about broadcast preservation. To the extent that I have my own personal collection of stuff, but I'm really more an advocate, an evangelist for preservation. And I'm happy to be honored for that. You know, there are other archivists. David Gleason, who has won this award in the past, would be like the best example. I mean, he truly has an archive, and thank God he does. I've used it myself, learned a whole lot from him. He's got worldradiohistory.com, which you should check out. It's amazing.
Great website.
Yeah. But look, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to use this moment to talk about how important I think broadcast preservation is, because it's our collective history. You know, it's like we think about what is America? We're asking existential questions. Well, it's who we are, what we've been, what we've done. And, you know, for the last century, we've been explaining it to audiences on radio and television. And to the extent that we have a record of it, we better save it. In certain respects, some companies, that mine in particular, does an extraordinary job of maintaining a physical and digital archive that I've been very privileged to be able to use. It's a great day for me when I can do a piece, as I often do for Start Here, which is our daily topical news podcast from ABC, available wherever you get your podcasts. And I can use a little bit of Peter Jennings explaining a story. When I was at CBS, one of the projects I'm proudest of was a 3-part documentary, 3 hour. We had 3 hours to fill for the radio hole on holidays. A 3-hour documentary on the murder, the cold case, unsolved murder of George Polk. You've heard of the George Polk Award. That's an important distinction in journalism. Well, it's named after a CBS News correspondent who was murdered in Greece in 1948. They pinned it on a man who was a suspected communist who was tortured into giving a false confession. CBS covered the story at the time in 1948, and really only one time after that, in 1990-ish, when Ed Bradley did a look back for 60 Minutes. I worked for a great manager at CBS named Craig Swagler, who greenlit my exploration of that story. And I'm very proud of the work. It won a National Headliner Award for Best Radio Documentary a couple of years ago. And it still lives somewhere online. You can look for it, just search for Who Killed George Polk. But what we were able to do was unearth some material from Edward R. Murrow and his team that had only aired on the CBS radio network in 1948 and not again after that. So I worked with archivists to resurrect that, authors who had extensively reported the story and written books about it in the early 90s. And we brought it to life on the 75th anniversary of George Polk's murder. And that ran over Memorial Day weekend in 2023. And poetically, I'll say, it aired on the CBS radio network on some of the same stations over some of the same transmitters that carried George Polk's voice in the 1940s when he was a reporter for CBS.
Isn't that something? I would love to hear. Does that live online now?
Yes, you can find it on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere else. Just search Who Killed George Polk.
You are wise beyond your years, Steven. This has been just a pure pleasure learning about you. What a remarkable career, and you've got so many more years to go. I think a lot of people would look at what you've done already and say that is just absolutely phenomenal, which it is, and I can't wait to see you grow and become even a bigger force in the news business and the broadcast business. Do you have time for one more bonus question?
Yeah, sure.
What are some advice that you would have for people that are looking to get into television and radio today? Because you and I came up obviously in a different era, that are wondering about their future because things have absolutely changed.
Yeah, I mean, listen, things constantly change. And I think the enduring story of radio is one of change. I mean, I'm a student of it, so I can appreciate it and hopefully explain it. The idea is we're constantly looking for ways to continue to deliver an essential service to a very large audience with fewer and fewer resources. And so, how we are able to do it is by leveraging talent, skill, ambidexterity, people who are able to, these days now, and obviously increasingly work across platforms and, develop content for social media, develop content that can live in the video space, that either can be repurposed for radio. One of the great examples of this, and not everybody can do it because it's a really particular skill, but you look at a guy like Matt Shearer at WBZ in Boston. This is a radio reporter who creates TikTok videos, and he's a sensation in Boston and has gotten global attention for some of his really creative work. I'm a huge fan of his. He may not know it, but I think he's great. And I think of myself, because I know you called me young at the top of the show. I don't feel it. I really don't. I feel like, I'm the old curmudgeon, shouting at clouds. But I think, one of the ideas is that you realize that, whether we're talking into a microphone and, radiating from towers at a few 100,000 cycles per second, or whatever it is, or we're talking into the devices that we carry around in our pockets that enable us to be our own broadcasters, editors, publishers, whatever. The idea is it's all about the content. And I think one of the things that I personally bring to the table is a degree of experience and acumen, covering the intersection of politics and the law and helping easily digest and explain some very complex, particularly sometimes esoteric legal concepts and how it's shaping and evolving. My job is to distill it all down to about 4 sentences. And that's not easy, but I carry with me, a quarter century of experience and front row hands-on view of how this is all played out. And if you can do that on radio, you can do it on television, you can do it on social media, that's the key. But really, you have to know your stuff. And if you know your stuff and you can develop the content in a way that's engaging, that's going to help you tremendously.
Phenomenal advice. Steven, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to seeing you in November, and congratulations on that award. It is much deserved, and I'm looking forward to celebrating with you, my friend.
Thank you, Chachi. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you'll leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to follow on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been a Benztown McVeigh podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Engineered by Darren Silva and Megan Vasquez. Produced and edited by Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator Suzanne Aksu and Robbie Gessel.